Ja, hjertelig velkommen til disse Ph.d.-verjene. Jeg er ferdig nå å slå over i engst. Verjan være enskånd. Vi er kommet her til Ph.d.-verjene til Turið Hermannsdóttir. Og hun har lært Ph.d. avhandling inn, så vi heter noen... Sorry, I was meant to speak English. Apologies. Rewind, start again. Right, our PhD student is Turið Hermannsdóttir, and the title of her thesis is Reproductive Manoeuvring, an ethnography study about women's abortion and other reproductive experiences in the Faroe Islands. The supervisors who have guided Turið through the process are Fróðskaparsetur, who is professor at the University of the Faroe Islands, and Bettina Dubro, Professor Emerita from Roskilde University. And Turið has been registered for a double degree at the University of the Faroe Islands and Roskilde University. Also, I would like to introduce the assessment committee. We have Stine Willum Adrian, who is Associate Professor in Sociology of the Arctic University of Norway, and Associate Professor in Techno-Anthropology at Aalborg University. Also, we have Nana Schneiderman, Associate Professor of the Department of Anthropology at Aarhus University. And with us online, we have, there we have, Marcin Smetana. Welcome, Marcin, affiliated lecturer and in the Reproductive Sociology Research Group at the Department of Sociology at the University of Cambridge, and he is also a research associate at Queen Mary University of London. And then we have Nicole Tualagang, who's associate professor and co-chair at Roskilde University, co-chair of the assessment committee, and myself, Erika Ann Hayfield. I am associate professor and also chairing the assessment committee, and I'm from the University of the Faroe Islands. Now, I'd just like to talk you through the agenda for today. After my introduction, Turið will present for 30 minutes about her thesis. And after that, Stine Willum Adrian will be the first opponent. And then we will have a break. After the break, Marcin Smetana will be the second opponent, and then Nana Schneiderman will be the third opponent. After the opponents have discussed with Turið her PhD thesis, there is opportunities for questions from the audience. And if there's anybody who has a question for Turið, I would be grateful if you let me know during the break. And after potential questions from the audience, Nicole Tualagang will wrap up, and the assessment committee will leave the room to vote. Now, so the first section is when Turið is presenting her PhD, and after that, when the opponents address Turið, they will discuss with Turið her PhD and provide her also with some critical questions, which is what we do in academia. And we also would like to just briefly go through the reasons for putting Turìd's thesis forward for defense. First of all, the aim of Turið Hermannsdóttir's thesis was to provide an anthropological account of women's lived abortion and reproductive experiences in the Faroe Islands. The PhD is structured into 8 chapters, including 2 papers, of which one has been published in the Journal of Medical Anthropology. And as I said, the PhD has been approved for defense, and the committee has provided the following reasons for approving the thesis. The PhD thesis is an important, well-written and very strong contribution to research on not only abortion in the Faroe Islands, but also reproductive politics within the Nordic welfare states. Previous researchers have examined public discourses, norms and attitudes around abortion. But Turid's PhD offers new insights into that, in that it centres on the stories and experiences of Faroese women considering, accessing and speaking about abortion. Tori has, through her intimate understanding of the Faroese context and delicate ethnographic work, with great methodological and ethical clarity, being able to access stories and experiences in Faroese women's reproductive lives that have so far been absent because of the cultural stigma around abortion in the Faroe Islands. This speaks back to public and political discourses in abortion in the Faroes, at times reproduced in research, portraying women who consider or choose abortion as either victims or reproductive injustice, or perpetrators of taking the fetus, as the Faroese term frames it. The work with women's abortion narratives brings to light complexities and nuances of agency, choice, and belonging in practices of what Tori calls reproductive manoeuvring. Another scientific contribution from the thesis consists in characterizing a changing Faroese society, or, to use the author's term, turbulent reproductive landscape. This change is shown in particular in the third section of the analysis, which shows how women's imaginations herald social change. The PhD thesis has thus analytical contributions beyond the study of abortion in the Faroes into the field of reproductive governance and citizenship in modern states, characterized by divides between cosmopolitan and traditionalist policies. But it also contributes to anthropological considerations of how to study silences and how to conceptualize agency and constraints in relation to reproduction and kinship. The empirical work is impressive, and ethnographic vignettes are considered to be powerful, and the written presentation is both engaging and captivating. So I would like to give the floor to you, Turið, for your presentation.
Thank you. Is it okay, the sound? Okay. Dear everyone, dear committee, thank you for carefully reading my PhD thesis and taking the time and making the effort to come all the way to the Faroe Islands. And thank you, Marcin, I think I'm looking at you now. Thank you for joining us online, despite the hindrances. Now I will turn to the audience. Thank you for joining us physically and online. Before we begin, I would like to set the frame. The room is filled with people with different backgrounds and are attending with different purposes. Some have had abortion experiences themselves, and some have had other reproductive experiences. And some have even cared for others in abortion experiences. I will myself try to speak with care, and I hope that you will think with care too. I will be using the word abortion while I talk more specifically about early induced abortions, which are defined prior to the 12th week of gestation. The abortion procedures are both surgical and chemical, or medical, as you also call it. Abortion is a precarious matter of one most important aspect, namely that it is at one and the same time a highly personal and intimate matter and a highly political and public matter. And it is at this nexus that it becomes precarious because we interchangeably tend to lean towards the one trail rather than the other. So this thesis also moves within this nexus. I want to introduce you to Monica. She was 33 years old at the time of the interview and was 23 years old when she had her abortion. She had found out that she was pregnant after a one-night stand and had gone to her general practitioner. And she said, "Times were different back then. It was before all this my choice and my body and all these women's movements, because I have often thought that one day, when it's appropriate, I'll tell my story on a stage. Because I don't want to be the only one left behind. These poor women who went through this and go for vita." One has often imagined just standing up and saying, "No, that's not how it was. This happened and that was bad," but then you move on. Especially now that everything is so open, and those from Fróðskaparsetur, they're asking for more stories. This excerpt represents what is at the heart of the matter of the study, and what has been at stake for the women and for the study. I asked women to narrate something that many of them had not uttered into words ever before. Some had talked about their experience to friends and family members. Some had talked to other people, and some had even told their abortion experience in public. But today, I am here bringing their story onto the stage. I will briefly go through the outline of the presentation. First, I will present the frame in laying out the law and study design and methodology. Then I will address the post-research questions and theoretical inspirations. And afterwards, I will lay out the analyses and key concepts of the thesis and address the last discussion of the thesis, namely about a paradox in the Nordic welfare society. Finally, I will conclude and address the contributions. To draw out the legal context, abortion is not on demand as we know it from some of the Faroes' neighboring countries. The Abortion Act is an old Danish abortion act from 1956. A grant has to be given by first a general practitioner and then a gynecological obstetrician. The doctors can grant access to abortion based on 4 different criteria that all address medical or legal reasons. The first one addresses the health or life of the pregnant woman in danger. The second is if the pregnancy has occurred due to a violation to the woman's bodily freedom, that is either rape or incest. And third, there has been a detection of serious risks to the life or health of the fetus. And fourth, the pregnant woman is deemed unfit to nurture for a potential child. The limit for abortion grants is up until the 16th of gestation week. However, in practice, it's up until the 12th week of gestation. There are many factual issues concerning the abortion legislation due to its age, but also due to it's been constructed or worded in a different country than the Faroe Islands. For instance, medical technologies have been advanced since 1956 that ultimately change some of these conditions. This research was conducted in what I have identified as a turbulent reproductive landscape. In 2016, when I first submitted my research proposal, no one had abortion in their mouth, as one of the interlocutors phrased it. In 2017, the Faroe authorities prepared for the delegation of the abortion legislation that was due in 2018. And this set on a heavy public debate. And this was also when the first pro-choice organization, Fróðskaparsetur, was established. From being a social silent topic, it was debated everywhere, in the media, even in international media, on public events, and on social media. Within 5 years, we went from having no one having abortion in their mouth to a female politician running for election to publicly say that she'd had an abortion. These are examples of the turbulent reproductive landscape. Now I want to lay out the study design and the sample. I moved back to the Faroe Islands after 11 years abroad. The research design takes the form of an ethnographic study consisting of 20 formal interviews, one of which is with a gynecological obstetrician, and 13 are abortion narratives, and 6 are reproductive stories. 2 of the women who had an abortion had gone to Denmark to receive abortion care. I knew I was researching a sensitive issue, so I also threaded with care in the recruitment process. I used sensitive methods such as the snowball effect, letting the word spread mouth by mouth, and messaging women personally. But coming closer to the end of the research or the fieldwork, I participated in a radio show, and where I talked about my Ph.D. thesis, and I announced that I was still looking for more participants. Before the show even had ended, I had 3 private messages. And after 3 days, I believe I had 31 responses. But due to a time limit and a saturation in the sample, I only conducted conducted formal interviews with 7 of these women who had responded. This huge interest informs on the turbulent reproductive landscape. I am a woman. I'm Faroese born, a researcher, and I have my own reproductive experiences. I moved back home to conduct ethnographic fieldwork. My position gave me a unique access to an empirical field that was otherwise difficult to get access to. As such, it can be said that I was entangled in the field. And this hints to the issue of representation. I could not represent everyone in the Faroe Islands. I do not have the same access to men as I do with women. I do not have the same access to black women or newcomers to the Faroes as I do with white women. I do not have the same access to different socioeconomic classes as I do with my own. That is, I'm not saying that I have an objective or unaffected access to knowledge in the Faroes. Rather, I have an access to a situated knowledge. In saying so, I do not mean that all the women in the sample have the same socioeconomic background as I do, or same opportunities as I've had, or same experiences as I've had. That is, I'm not saying that I research myself. Rather, I'm saying that my position allowed for a particular knowledge to take place instead of another knowledge. An overall research question can be framed as such. How are women's reproductive lived experiences constrained and entangled? What are possible strategies that women turn to in getting access to abortion? What is at stake for women's selfhood and citizenship in relation to reproductive dilemmas? The aim was to explore women's reproductive experiences as such as abortion, and how this interplays on a societal and political level. As such, I do not ask into what is subjugating or what restricts women's choices. Rather, I ask what shapes their experiences and what are their possibilities of agency otherwise. To break down the overall research questions, 3 sub-research questions are developed, whereas each question is dealt with in 3 separate analyses. The first one addresses how is abortion silence manifested in women's lives? And 2, how are women's reproductive citizenship maintained and contested? And 3, what are women's impossibilities of subject positioning and identity expression? The sub-questions are developed in close connection with a back-and-forth flow between literature knowledge, preconceived knowledge, and initial empirical knowledge. But what grows across these sub-research questions is that they all seek to explore reproductive constraints and entanglements. Now I want you to meet Björk. Björk was 41-year-old at the time of the interview and was 19 when she had her abortion. And she says, and then I was at the doctor's. The first time was just about trying to convince me not to get an abortion. And she's the family doctor. So she kept saying, it's a good support base, the family, you know? To me, that was so personal. To talk about my family, it had nothing to do with it. I mean, I'd got pregnant and that had to change. She wanted me to think about it for a week, so I had to wait until the 9th week. And when I came back, she was still reluctant. And then she suddenly says, "You'll have to excuse me, a little baby is coming in and it's really ill." And I was like, of course, you know. And then I just sat there for a long while, I remember, and I waited, and I felt like I was wasting a doctor's time who had sick people to care for. I felt bad. And then she came back and was still reluctant and thought I should think more about it and come back a couple of days later. I remember I was like, I almost bowed down on the floor and like begged. I was so desperate. But then I left again and I came back. When I returned, she had gone on her 2nd honeymoon. So I don't know if she just thought I was going to have it, the baby, like she has a good mother, so it'll be all right. In one of the early codings, I noted a lack of rights language in the women's reproductive narratives. After thorough critical reflexivity on why I expected a rights language and how it challenged me, I found that it challenged my own bias towards what was valid, what behavior, thoughts, and activity are legitimate and what is not. Many of the available theories to us today buttress on a Western ideal of the free and autonomous agent, and of subversion as always repetitive, public, and voiced. The value of agency has been measured by its efficacy in reproducing, resisting, or altering structures. It made me reflect on how can we understand different kinds of agency. This line of thought is very much inspired by scholars such as Saba Mahmood, who encourages us to think differently about the desiring free and autonomous agent, and Jennifer Engst, who argues that agency is always constrained and we therefore need to think in those terms theoretically too. Laila Abu-Lugod explores different types of resistance as legitimate acts of agency and citizenship. Thinking in line with these scholars, I theoretically sought out to challenge this Western ideal of the free agent and ask different questions in order to approach a different analytical gaze of women's participation in society. But was there a single theoretical orientation that I could turn to in order to analyze my empirical material and thus answer the research questions? Abortion and reproductive dilemmas are obviously political matters, and the framework of politics of reproduction has importantly illustrated that the relationship between the citizen, state, and reproduction. It shows how reproductive acts and desires are governed. But there was something else at play too. It was also a highly personal and intimate matter. And I would do injustice to the material if I was unable to interlink the theoretical attention to the politics to the more personal and intimate gaze. It was here that Tine Gammeltoft's notion of reproductive choices as made in a quest to belong, that I noticed how it resonated with my own empirical material. Gammeltoft is able to come to this argument because she perceives reproductive choices as arenas for subject making. So the material also forced me to theoretically think to turn to matters of morality. However, abortion is not only a political matter or a moral matter, they're also highly bodily matters. My empirical material is arguably spoken words and less body, but still there was so much body in the spoken words. The stories were about bodies, citizenship, and selfhoods at stake and taking shape. The 3 research questions are chronologically answered in each research article. The first one is published in Journal of Medical Anthropology, and the point of departure here was the societal and subjective silence in abortion silence in the Faroe Islands. To many of the women participating in the study, this was the first time ever talking about their abortion, and thus it was a tacit experience for some. something they hid to almost not feel in their existence at all. With stories of self-censorship and hidden experiences, I wanted to explore how it manifested in women's lives and what meaning it had. As Barbara, for example, who was furious about the abortion stigma in the society and said, that's exactly the point, that you must defend yourself in some way, which I would have done if I said it in public. Because that's like the standards, so that's what I must relate to. The women related to an expected and felt ruling moral regime, where embodiment of femininity and a good woman is to a large extent identified through motherhood. Being silent means that they could achieve a desired value to belong. In other words, their quest to belong was in some way propelled by a feeling of othering. Like Björk, who said, I didn't really talk to anyone about it. I literally thought I was going to be the first Faroese to ever have an abortion, because I'd never heard of anyone else. The silent had a temporal aspect, an immediate one that secured their access to abortion care, and a futuristic aspect that secured their value as women, citizens, and potential mothers in the imagined future. That is, the women's silence had a meaning in their lives. It was a renegotiation to belong to either nation, family, or community. But lastly, I also found that this silence created a conflict in women's subjectivity, of publicly belonging, but feeling a disbelonging. This created a conflictuous subjectivity and led me to conceptualize the concept of performed belonging. The second research article is written together with my supervisor, Bettina Duplo, and it's a review in the Journal of Citizenship Studies. In this article, the empirical departure is the emotional language in women's reproductive narratives. We wanted to explore the interplay between the subjectivity and citizenship. We find that women felt social expectations of their bodies and citizenship. Like Barbara, who said, there's another way of being a mother and grandmother in the Faroes, which isn't elsewhere, you know? And those who don't have those moms and grandmothers, they're missing out, kind of. How many don't you know who walked home to their grandmother after school every day? I mean, I've never had that relationship to my grandmother, and so I've longed for it. And so I've thought, I'll make sure I'll be that grandmother, you know? Barbara's quote highlights how certain bodies can give access to certain things in society. Var, on the other hand, spoke of a mismatch in her body-landscape relation, in saying, I just remember the feeling. It was at the pediatric ward, so kids were running around, and there were children's cries and diapers, and I was really determined to get this out of me. And I vomited, and my breast grew. I was really pregnant. Now I know what it's like, but without anyone knowing about it, right? And I knew I was going back to school when I got back, and life could start again, or so. That feeling was liberating. With stories like these, we find that women make sense of their reproductive citizenship through bodily and interrelational trajectories. If we elevate our gaze, it becomes clear how women's bodies are exemplified battles in society and are used by women themselves as a mean to attain and protect reproductive citizenship or inclusion. The third analysis is presented as an analytical section. It will be further developed into an article. In the third analysis, I set out to explore women's possibilities for subject positioning and identity expression. My point of departure were women's claims such as, things were different back then, it's much easier today, and so forth. This puzzled me, as on a structural level, nothing had changed. The abortion legislation was still the same. So what was the difference felt by women, and how did it manifest itself in their reproductive experiences? I found that to the women, the difference was the turbulence, and that it made room for things to be imaginatively tested, negotiated, navigated, adopted, and contested. Like Greta, who imagined helping young women like she once was through an abortion hotline. Or Helena, who, like Monica, imagine standing up in front of a crowd and tell a different abortion narrative. Importantly, I argue that these imaginations are transformative actions on a subjective level, even if they are not unfolded yet on a public level. The three analyses have led me to develop two central concepts. The proposed concept of reproductive manoeuvring is used to analyze the different kinds of agency that women make use of in a restricted abortion landscape. It is a concept that seeks to be attentive of not reproducing universalistic, static, and deterministic Western notions of agency, contestation, and freedom. Rather, it aims to make analytical space to explore the subtle, the ambivalent, the silent, and the imaginative as legitimate. The concept is, as such, useful in unfolding reproductive constraints and entanglements. Reproductive manoeuvring is the craft of managing reproductive necessities while maintaining and caring for one's multiple belongings. And so this concept seeks to legitimize women's participation and experiences in society. The second developed concept is the turbulent reproductive landscape. The way I discuss turbulence in the thesis is concerned with two different aspects, although inextricably linked. One is how the turbulence affected the methodology of the study and how it affected my own being in the field, while the other discusses how the women's reproductive narratives were affected by the turbulence and how this turbulence propelled women's imaginations for a new belonging and becoming. But why imagination? Why did the women not go onto the streets and stand on the stage and say no? Erica Ann Hayfield notes how in the Faroe Islands, individuals and their actions are inextricably tied, arguing that the close-knit relations construct a moral responsibility. Helene Priste Nielsen links the lack of anonymity to constrain women, possibilities of identity expression. The empirical material in this study illuminates women's identity expressions as constrained by the close-knit relations. And in my empirical material, it becomes clear that the turbulence in the reproductive landscape functions as a space of possibility. However, there is still much at stake. So how they use this space of possibility becomes an imaginative act. So perhaps social transformation and subversion in a small-scale island society will look different than in a larger society. Perhaps we can understand imaginations to indicate and even buttress social change. Approaching the end of the presentation, I want to highlight the paradox in women's experiences with a restricted reproductive landscape and being a citizen in the Nordic welfare society. Many of the interlocutors seemed perplexed and almost surprised when they stood face to face to the restricted access and structural silence. Like Alda said, it's not until you've tried having your bodily autonomy taken away that you understand the magnitude of it. But what puzzled me in Alda's expression is that she never had that bodily autonomy. But nevertheless, she felt a bodily autonomy until she was faced with a reproductive dilemma and was caught in the paradox of the modern and traditional society. I do not claim that the Nordic welfare model promises abortion rights. Neither does any other human rights treaty specifically say so. However, what I, in line with other scholars, notice is that the Nordic welfare model creates specific Nordic welfare subjects. And these subjects, they expect a high level of freedom and autonomy. But in the case of reproduction, we might say that we find these reproductive subjects on the contours of the Nordic welfare society. Their expectations of freedom and autonomy will be challenged, and their difference will be more clearly marked. Together, the three analyses answer the overall research question. In sum, they inform on how women's reproductive experiences are entangled in and constrained by a moral, social, and political landscape, while at the same time being a highly personal and intimate matter. With the concept of reproductive manoeuvring, I have analytically unfolded silences, interrelations, and imaginations as legitimate acts of agency, as well as illustrating how these maneuverings are managed at the time being and thus not given or goal-like or fixed. And as such, I've demonstrated that women persistently struggle to be agentive actors in the society while still nurturing for their multiple belongings as women and as citizens in the Faroes. I hope that my PhD thesis will have multiple contributions, both locally and scientifically. The study seeks to contribute locally by illuminating how women maneuver in this restricted reproductive landscape. But there is still so much more to do. For one, there's a huge knowledge gap in Faroese abortion and reproductive landscape. We need to have more solid statistical knowledge of abortion requests, grants, and denials, and abortion exile, which is traveling to other countries to attain abortion care. We basically need an abortion mapping. And two, this does not only apply for reproductive dilemmas and abortion for heterosexual couples or women. We need to examine how marginalized groups have their access to reproductive healthcare services and what their possible D-routes are when meeting restriction. As such, the study can function as a stepping stone to illuminate the necessity to research more into this area in the Faroes. On an international level, the study contributes to conditions for marginalized groups in the Nordic welfare society. On a theoretical level, I believe the PhD thesis contributes to anthropological knowledge on how to study silences, interrelations, and ambivalences and imaginations as legitimate acts. Lastly, I find that the thesis illustrates that by being theoretically eclectic, it creates analytical room for the political, personal, and moral at one and the same time, because that is where lived experiences are at. And thank you very much for your attention, and thank you to the women participating in the study. This would not have been possible without your courage and trust. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Turið, for an enlightening and very interesting presentation. So we're now going to move to giving the floor to the first opponent, which is Stine Willum Adrian. And as I mentioned earlier, Stine is at the Arctic University of Norway and also at Aalborg University. And each opponent has been given 40 minutes max, so I will flag up when there's 5 minutes left.
First, I want to thank you for inviting me to be one of the opponents for your defense. It's a great honor. I need to take off my glasses. Because this is a historic day. It's a day where a dissertation, your work, for the first time will voice Faroese women's stories on reproductive lives and abortion, a theme that has been silenced and tabooed, as you have just described in your presentation. The study is timely, and as you also mentioned, this research was actually initiated before these discussions became public in the Faroe Islands, so you have been very good at being part of that movement and maneuvering in it as well. It's also a very challenging theme to unpack as a PhD student, because it is political controversial, not only here in the Faroe Islands, but globally. But it is also very important because the voices of Faroese women telling their stories about abortion and their reproductive lives, they are missing, and there's still a lot of work to be done in the public sphere. But also, it's missing from research. Before I begin my part of the opposition, I want to underline that I and we as a committee find that your thesis is very well done, just as Erika also started off telling. We are impressed by how you have managed to make women talk about their reproductive experiences and abortion stories. And this has only been possible because you are an excellent ethnographer that has a good sensitivity towards the ethical and challenging dilemmas that they are facing in their everyday life regarding their reproductive lives. It has been an emotional, touching read and challenging read of that reason as well. And this is also a great contribution to the international literature on abortion. So there's a public contribution, but there's also an important contribution to the research. So this is also why I have looked very much forward for today to have this discussion with you. I invite you to think this of a discussion and to have the opportunity to unpack what you have written in your thesis. And as a committee member, of course, my job is also to take up those questions that need some unpacking and some development further. So this is what we are going to do. And as you know, we have divided the work between us in the committee. And my work will be to bring up a number of questions regarding the development of your research questions that you have been going through here, and how that has shaped your analytical choices, and what it means methodologically to have focus on embodied experiences when you work on an intimate theme such as abortion and reproductive lives. And so actually you have further developed your research questions here. So it is not what is written in the text, what came up here. And I think this is really an interesting question that you bring forward, because in your text, there's not like an overall research question defining. So I think now when we start talking, please go back to the slide. So we will come back to this major research question, that is, how are women's reproductive lived experiences constrained and entangled? And what are the possible strategies that women turn to in getting access to abortion? What is at stake in women's selfhood and citizenship in relation to reproductive dilemmas? And you can see this has then been operationalized into your 3 different texts, where the first one is the one that you had published, which is called Manoeuvring in Silence, Abortion Narratives and Reproductive Life Histories from the Faroe Islands. The second one is the one called submitted to citizenship studies, emotions of reproductive citizenship, narratives and reproductive abortion landscapes, which focus on citizenship. And the question is, how is women's reproductive citizenship maintained and contested? How is their reproductive citizenship embodied? How is the reproductive citizenship renegotiated? And then the third part, which is your analytical text, you ask, what are women's impossibilities for subject positioning and expressions of selfhood? What role do imaginations play in the renegotiations of a belonging and reproductive citizenship? And all of these research questions, as you very well put forward here in your talk, they challenge, or they somehow build on the existing literature on abortion, and you challenge this focus of choice that has been in the previously. You challenge this idea about the autonomic person. So, and I think this is a very interesting choice, but it also made me curious to what it is in the first place that made you think that the voices of women from the Faroe Islands about their reproductive stories and their abortion stories need to be brought forward. So I want us to start there. Why did you see this at a time when no one was having abortion in their mouth, as you said?
So why I asked into
Yes.
This subject and why?
Yes.
That's a really good question, and I think it's twofolded for me, because things are perhaps built up in your without you knowing it sometimes. So the one folded answer is that I myself am Faroese. I have my own experiences, and I have my own, witnessing this growing up in the Faroes as a woman, and from being a small girl to, teenager to and then, our friends, we become sexual agents, and this can happen, and this, this could happen, and what would you do if that happened? These conversations are a part of growing up, probably in every country, despite the legal context, and also because all reproductive contexts are constrained or are governed in some way. So one is like a personal, a very personal drive for it that has awakened my interest in what is unfair here, and what is injustice here, and what are my friends struggling with, and why don't we speak about it afterwards? Like, why do I know that this happened, and then when it has happened, like this girl becomes pregnant, and I know it, and I know she's going to have an abortion, but we never speak of it again. So how is this like silence just like becomes a part of all of us? That's like a very, intimate interest to the subject that I guess has always just been lying there. So I don't know if some people are just born feminists, I don't know, and just are interested in or if you're raised such. And then there's another interest that is an interest from my times through academia. So when I was studying medical anthropology at Durham University, I had this professor, this supervisor, who was really engaged in reproductive and sexual health rights and health and rights. So I guess I was also introduced to this literature that just fitted so well to my personal experiences. So I think that has just always been, this has to be. And I've done other kinds of smaller studies or assignments throughout the academia that also were concerned with these reproductive issues. And I think that at least I'm glad that I didn't do this. I asked into this until now, because this is a challenging question. So I think it was an academic introduction that was given, and a personal that just fitted very well. I think that's why I, and then it was completely an incident that it happened in, that I proposed, I had submitted this project proposal in 2016 and had gotten pregnant and was on maternity leave, and I didn't start until 2017. So that was just completely an incident that totally turned my project upside down. I had to I had to, think of it totally different. All of a sudden, this thing that I wanted to, in 2016, I wanted to open up this discussion, was opened up, for me. And then I had to okay, then, then something is already happening in the society that I didn't induce. So I had to move with that and be a part of it.
And this is exciting.
Yeah.
I think this is really an opportunity as an ethnographer to be able to follow these changes when they happen in your field. So then you interview women about their stories. And when you look at the way you have structured your thesis, there's a lot of, you have like three texts where there are different foci. But there are a lot of different concepts that are at stake here. So silence is the focus in the first one. In the second one, it's emotions, embodiment, and reproductive citizenship. And then selfhood and belonging and citizenship is part of the third article. And I'm curious, how did these themes come up? Why that? Because when you think of women's lived experiences, there can be so many things that come out in these stories. Yeah. So I'm really curious about what were these stories about, and how did you find these themes when you were reading through or going through your empirical material and you getting these stories?
Yeah. And that's a really good question, and I'm really happy that we can, open up that discussion, because that is definitely something that has not been in the text been delivered that much in like these choices of, because you're so right, there could be so many things to open up and to different ways to go with this, right? I think for one, so I have different answers for the article or for the analyses, and one thing that was kind of like an overall kept being like, remember this, was my position. So that was. And that's not something that I just invented myself, of course. That's also, being, that's something, anthropology also teaches you, of course, that being always close to your empirical material. And so an overall guidance for me all the time, or like a stick to remember or something, was that, remember to always take on those things that would be much more difficult for others to get access to. Remember to engage with this in I don't want to see deeper, because that is, like a too simplistic way of saying it, like that there's something deep analysis and then there's something shallow analysis, and that's not really how it is. But that there's a, I could have a different gaze. I could ask different questions. I could get, see different things, and that was like an overall, in line with my knowledge to the consisting literature on it that is very focused on choices and what is subjugating and all of this, which has been a huge, a very important work, and that needed to be done before we can even turn to this stuff. But now I could do something else, and perhaps. So there was also another issue in that no one had research into this before. So not just that, in the material, as you say, so many things can be taken up, but also that no one had researched on this in the Faroes ever before. So I could just, choose whatever. And not only that, but I think also that a lot of people during my fieldwork had different expectations of what they wanted me to do because of the necessity of it, I guess, right? So that was like in an overall, reminder to me. And then for the 3 analyses, I think that how I perceive it, at least, is that I think that the first one is quite a given, because that was like the silences. That was just, okay, now we're opening up this, we get people to talk and stuff like that, right? And so that was just, these first codings of themes, finding themes, and like how, and that's where my interest, like, why aren't they talking about rights? Like, why aren't they talking about, like, we don't want this, like, this is horrible, or something like that? Why aren't they, where are those words, and where are those, those stories? Like, why did they, because I didn't ask, let's sit down and you tell me your deepest thoughts, let's go all the way into your, like, don't talk politics, like, go all the way in. I didn't say that, I always started with, like, an opening question of, tell me about the first time you found out that you were pregnant, or something like that. So that whole thing that we will probably get into later. So this silence, those words that weren't used, and other words that were used that I didn't expect, and stories that went into, and that is a part of the silence. So this self-censorship and stuff like that. So that was like something that I also expected, the silence, and something that protruded the whole sample, like the whole empirical material. And then I think that the last one is the imaginations are, like, closely connected to that one, to the silences, because what do you do with all of this if you're not doing it in public or voiced and stuff? So these women imagining stuff, and, like, all these, like, I would, or I want to, and especially these, like, ambivalences, these but I am, I would say it in public, but I haven't done it. All these, like, different, like, almost contradictions sometimes. Of, like, wow, there is a lot at stake here, right? So those 2, I think, are very much connected in the themes, in the like initial themes when I was coding the.
Can I just ask, how did you code?
Yeah, so I quite down to earth, non-technological, but I did use in vivo, but I did not go into the whole in vivo plate, what it can do, and I didn't do that because I wanted still to be engaging myself with. So I also, even if I had in vivo, where you can tap in, your material and all of the transcripts from the interviews, you can tap that in, and then you can, when you read it, you can make your own themes, and then you can, like, code in that way, and, like, almost like when you're highlighting stuff, like, this is the same as that one, as that was in that one, but just online, or just on a program. So I did use that, but still it was closer to a more how to say, like, a manual thing, more of a manual thing, really just literally reading the stuff and finding, just having them all out and seeing, like, where are the similarities here? What are they talking about? Like zooming out, what are they talking about? Is it, like, are there completely different directions? Which I very quickly found out that they weren't. They were very much almost like very much the same themes that came up, and very much the same things that the women chose to, or what came into being in the interviews. So it was quite a manual thing like that. I don't know if it's a bit old school.
No.
anthropology.
No. I'm just curious to what you did, because that's to unpack also, because what I'm trying to get at is to have you unpack a little more of what you also said that is not in the text.
Yeah,
Your
exactly.
analytical cuts, your decisions, what are behind these cuts.
Yeah.
And so now you have spoken mainly on about the first text, Silence, which is a very beautiful article out there already. And and then you have the last text, which is, I think, where you're really strong ethnographically. It really comes out, your ethnographical power in that there's more space for the vignettes and unfolding your analysis in relation to them, because you are not trapped in the journal format where you have like maximum 8, maybe 9,000 words, and then you have to pack everything in there. But I'm a little curious to the second article about citizenship, because that is the article where you predominantly argue that it's about the lived life and embodiment and emotions. And then when I read it, I was, my idea about what embodiment is, and drawing on my knowledge of embodiment literature and also knowledge of literature on emotions or affects. You draw in Sarah Ahmed and her way of thinking about, you call it emotions, but she comes out of affect theory, right?
Yeah.
I was a bit surprised about then the stories you are telling, or the vignettes you are, because it didn't fit with my initial idea about what would be there.
Yeah.
So I would have expected more on what it literally means to go through an abortion and so on, and the experience of traveling to Denmark and all the details. And I know there's only 2 of your interviewees that told you stories about that, but still this is also a theme that comes up. And I'm not saying that this has to be in that article. I'm more curious to what is it that you mean by when you talk about embodiment and you talk about emotions, because it's not so clearly, and it's not that I'm coming from different types of theories or so I want you, if you can tell a little bit more about how you think of lived experience.
Very much. I would very much like to do that, and I think that I might go into different directions here, and you can interrupt me if it's as such. But it's. I think this was one of the most challenging and thus also most interesting stuff I did in the process, analytical process, because it challenged me so much. It challenged this, like, how do I do an embodiment analysis of or something that like of not abortion experiences, and not unpacking, like you said, traveling to different countries and what that takes and stuff like that, right? But why, how do I use that? That was one. And then something else, when I kept getting like, oh, I don't know if this is, how's this going? Like, how can I do this? Because I definitely, I know, these are the same, Sarah Ahmed, Judy Butler, Bronwyn Davies, and all these who are definitely, embodiment focused, and my analysis is not like theirs, and it goes a different direction in that what you would expect would happen using them. And I definitely, I'm aware of that, and then you could ask yourself, like, which I did, like, why not, leave them alone then? If it's that challenging to use it, like, why keep, doing? But I think that what interested me so much in this was that how can we like, if we don't want to do like yet another kind of thing, discourse analysis of abortion research, then how can we then do it?
But I'm
Yeah,
not.
you can.
I'm not thinking. I'm not thinking about discourse analysis.
No.
I'm thinking about, because you are saying you're saying you didn't want to think of the material where they told about the abortion or they told about their travel, which usually would be the material you would go to look at.
Yeah.
So actually, I would like your argument. Why do you not want to do that? Because that doesn't have anything to do with the choice that you have said. I want to leave that. And I think, you know, that decision of not going the choice way, it fits very well with Ahmed and Butler and so on. So it's more why not the material that is about the body, is about the experience and so on, when that's what you're saying you're doing.
Yeah. Yeah. One is that the interviews, how their stories often did not unpack the abortion experience. They did not go into. Often it was something that was kind of like, you know, as I also read out, like, then I went to the doctor. And it was like everything about that, you know, not the procedure, but like I didn't, you know, what doctor did I go to? There's another one who says that is like doctor shopping, and all of those things were like unfolded and talked about in length. And then it was like the time for the procedure, for instance, and that was not very often unfolded. It was often something that was skipped quite quickly. And then they talked again a lot about, you know, afterwards and what then and who did I talk to or who did I not talk to and how it is and you know, all of those things. So I think that it was very much the material that showed me these are not the actual procedures. These are not what came up when I was sitting with them, because of course that has happened to them, and you know, and they would probably unfold that in a different setting, perhaps, you know, who knows? But I don't think that the material was very. They did not go into details with that. So it was also much that.
I think this is analytically really interesting.
Yeah.
So again, I'm not saying that this is wrong but I think this is what do we learn from that? I think that what are there any analytical messages or understandings and how does that then become lived experiences? Or because as you said before, in the last article, the imagination was somehow a way of thinking about this in at least the experiences that you talk about there, that works very well. But would that also have been a framework that could help you in the second article?
What framework? Can you rephrase?
The concept of imaginations, is that what is at stake in the material that you called embodied experiences and emotional, or is it because embodied experience or embodiment is different, you know? So maybe my second question here is, what is embodiment then in that paper, and what does emotion becomes like in that paper?
And lost my track. And you also said this, how is that lived experiences, right?
Yeah.
And I just want to touch a bit on that, because it's like, why do we need to also restrict abortion experiences to the procedure? Like, why are before, and way before perhaps also, and after, not also a part of the experience and lived experience, right? So yeah, that was just a thing that, you know, and then I'm sorry, you said the imaginations and why this becomes embodiment, why the second one.
No, so I was asking whether the terminology of imagination could have been used in the second article and been more helpful for you than embodiment, the term of the concept of embodiment?
Maybe it could work because it's still about imagining their. Maybe it could, but I think that here's something else with here. It was more like we were more at like a testing level, and more of like it was more of a. They were looking like interrelationally. They were looking at different the one that I read, I can't remember her name right now, who was looking to her grandmother, or reflected, trajected her life, how can I become that, what I was missing, to not reproduce that to my daughters, so they are going to miss it, and so they, I think it was very much embodied because they were renegotiating their access to this, to get this value through their bodies and interrelationally. So I think it was. I saw so much body in it. Like they were but without it definitely like my way of using it is definitely challenge this more what you would usually go after completely. But I still think that there was so much body in their ways of thinking about their citizenship and their access to this value that somehow was sometimes a bit abstract, perhaps, but also very much how can I get it? It's through doing what that or this or stuff like that, right? And then as war also, this mismatch in not fitting in bodily, because she was not doing bodily what was expected of, I felt expectance, right? So I still think that it was embodied in that way, and I would love if we can have embodiment studies to also move into this and get embodiment studies more into different kinds. What is happening at as well as material, empirical material that tells you, I saw the blood or whatever, very materialistic, very. Oh yes, that is embodied. That is body. There's no question about that. But when we move, if we open up that space a bit, I would hope that we can do that, because I think there's, maybe we can, open up that one a bit, so we can have that great embodiment analysis into these. But I think this is something also that came quite late in, for instance, also my getting to know embodied citizenship by, especially further developed by Nika Rasmussen and the other one that I've forgotten the name of, that also talk of embodied citizenship, while I talk about embodied reproductive citizenship, and this was quite late that I noticed these, whereas before I was still interested in the embodiment analyses from all those that we mentioned before, and citizenship, but I felt I was connecting these two together. And then later, I found, these people who were actually also doing something very similar to me.
So now I want to, before I'm ending up, because I have very little time left, how much time? 4 minutes left. I want us to get back to the research question that you have posed, to kind of breach the different analytical parts, which I was missing a lot.
Yeah.
So I'm very happy about you developing this question. But I would like you to explain how this question get these three analytical cuts, how that brings these cuts together.
How they bring those cuts together. So it is, it's something that's not to the audience. It's not. This is not in the thesis, I'm sorry. Can you ask again, because how they
Because so the challenge of writing a journal-based thesis is always that you end up making articles, and they can be super good in their own, but they are still supposed to be part of one research project that conceptually is connected. And so what was missing was somehow a question that helped you make that connection in your thesis. So how does this help you in getting these three analytical cuts that you have in your text together?
So I think that so one is the question, which is of course developed now, and in the thesis I have this aim instead, right? And then I introduce the questions, right? And I think that what has helped me now to word this question is looking, because what I think connects the three analyses is exactly the proposed concept, right? The reproductive maneuvering. That is like what gives or connects all of these analyses, that these are examples of, these are like components of.
Why is it not in there?
Yeah, and I was like, I cannot ask of something that is a finding, right? Because reproductive maneuvering is a finding. So it's a bit.
And then I was thinking, I think that is possible. You always rework your
or figure it out afterwards. But I was thinking, okay, so I have the concept reproductive maneuvering, which which connects the articles or analyses. But then I was thinking, okay, then reflect on what is reproductive maneuvering, and then I was thinking, oh, that is what it is. It is and constraint and entanglement is, of course, something that I talk about throughout the thesis. And then I was like, okay, but why don't I use those words in the question? That was kind of my thought about it. But you think that it could even be in a question?
Yes.
Yeah.
And the turbulent landscape that is also that you have taken up here and create a wonderful frame for your thesis.
Yeah.
So, but here again, there are a lot of new concepts. So entanglement and so on. So there's also something about there's a lot of concepts, and which one are you holding on to and using, and which one are less useful? But that's something that. You can think further with. And
definitely.
I think Martin is the next one after the break. And I think maybe this question of reproductive maneuvering and reproductive turbulence will come up there. So you can think about that in the break.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for an enlightening debate. We're now going to have a break for 20 minutes. I make the time 14:22. So if we're back at just after 14:40. Thank you. And there's coffee and refreshments outside. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you are refreshed after a nice cup of coffee or glass of water or whatever. So we're ready now to start the second part of the discussion with Turið about her thesis. And the second opponent, who will be on our screen in just a second. Hello, Marcin. The second opponent is, just to remind you, is Marcin Smetana, who is an affiliated lecturer at the University of Cambridge and a research associate at Queen Margaret University of London. So I'm going to pass the floor over to you, Marcin.
Thank you very much, Erica. Can you hear me all fine? Yes. Okay, so first of all, thank you for having me here, for the opportunity to be part of this conversation. I am truly honored. And first of all, I'd like to thank you, Turið, for your brilliant ethnographic research and important insights. It's been fascinating, thought-provoking, and also touching, as Tina also said, to read your work, and I have learned a lot. And as introduction, I must say that your research is an important inspiration and speaks to many of the questions that are being raised in our research community. Currently, for example, in my research group, the Reproductive Sociology Research Group, ReproSoc at Cambridge, as well as other groups that I am part of at Queen Mary University of London, and also AFIN group at the Autonomous University of Barcelona and beyond. Some of that work you have quoted as well. So this conversation is ongoing, and that's why I'm also even happier to be part of it. And I would also like to say one last thing as introduction, how much I regret not being able to be with you in person today. But I do hope that this conversation will continue and that we will meet in person as well. Moving on to the questions, and thank you so much for your interesting and very helpful presentation, as well as the conversation with the first opponent that has laid the groundwork really well for what we're going to speak about right now. I would like to invite you now to discuss further the unique features and use of your concept of reproductive manoeuvring that you have introduced in your on your slides in your presentation. Could you say a little bit more about what we can learn thanks to this concept? What does the term help us grasp? What is reproductive manoeuvring, and importantly, how is it different from other concepts such as reproductive navigation? Importantly, throughout the thesis, perhaps in particular in data chapter 1, which is the medical anthropology article, but all throughout, you frequently use the concept of navigation. So could you expand a little bit on your discussion? You actually do include a discussion of manoeuvring and navigation. I noted down the pages 173 and onwards, where you discuss how reproductive manoeuvring is different from reproductive navigation, as articulated by Erica van der Sipt, for example. And you do state that two concepts share a lot. For example, their critique of the Western rational free agent. And you also note, as you have also said now in the presentation, that navigation implies a direction and maneuvering is management. And I have also checked etymologically just a moment ago in the Oxford Dictionary. So this overlaps, right? Also with sociological understandings that navigation indeed involves a route and maneuvering involves some skill or care etymologically. So, if you could just talk a little bit more about it, because you also write that maneuvering implies in particular management of belonging and citizenship, and it has particular meanings in the context of the Nordic welfare state. And it is also an umbrella term for other related concepts. And perhaps an entry point to this discussion could be a question about how you approached the term manoeuvring in your research process. Maybe you could start by that. Because as many times throughout your writing, you use the term navigation rather than manoeuvring. So is it because, that's my guess, your research process was that you started with the sensitizing concept of navigation, perhaps, and then you discovered manoeuvring, as you also said. So, you know, just to give you an example, I took an example from page 112, where you write, remaining silent is a navigational method to resist abortion stigma. Or then you write, remaining silent is a navigational strategy to maintain their value as moral citizens or good women. So what was your research process like with regard to the concepts of navigation and manoeuvring? And then what does the concept of manoeuvring contribute as compared to navigation? I can't hear you yet.
Is it something? Now it's
yes. Now
you
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And can
yeah.
you also
yeah.
see me?
Yes,
Yeah,
I can
okay,
see you. I can hear you. Perfect.
Okay,
Thank
perfect. Thank you. Thank you for that question, or those questions. I think there were many. And I think that we'll start there, with like how the process to coming to this, and then it will, of course, one thing lead to another, as we know often, and so it definitely, your intuition is right. So I was a lot of literature that I was reading was exactly talking about navigation, and yes, I was also inspired early on by social navigation, the concept of social navigation by Henrik V. From Copenhagen University. And so there was this social navigation concept going on, and there was, you know, an engagement with the concept of navigation in the reproductive literature as well. And there was also an engagement with like contestation, or, you know, or different concepts like those who separate these things, what is going on. So when you're navigating, you're doing like one thing, and then you're contesting, you're doing another thing. And then I was like, okay, but then you need to be really able to separate what is happening here. You're adopting something, you're contesting something, you're subversing something, or you're navigating something, or you're negotiating something. Like there was all these. So I think that the literature that I was reading was also using these words kind of, I don't know if it's being too bold to say unsystematically, because I was meeting these different concepts interchangeably. But I do think that they all mean different things, right? So that's the one thing that I guess I'm answering different questions at the same time, I can feel, but so that's the one thing, that there were these different concepts that made it important to be able to separate what these different things were. And I think that's really both a really difficult task to do, and then I also think that it's an unfortunate thing to do, to separate these things, because often it's much more of happenings that are happening at the same time, right? So you're perhaps, you know, contesting while you're also adopting, and you're navigating while you're negotiating, and, you know, because it's more complicated than, you know, okay, now it's like navigating, and now you're negotiating it, you know? So I think that was so yes, an umbrella term was, you know, I was searching for like, okay, but what is like, what is the less, or what is more than these very specific terms. And then, so that was, my search for something more including, something that was including more at the same time. And then another thing or process was that that as you initially really thought, that that's true, that I think navigation is, to me, I think it's too much of a, it's a steering, it's a more of a rational thing. And also when I was reading Henrik Vig and Erika van der Sipt, when I was reading their use of the concept, it was, even though I love their concepts, and I think, and Henrik Vig is very much used in different contexts, and I think it's a very good concept, of course. But I was searching for something a bit more, a bit more concerned with the more chaotic and spontaneous and here and now, than that you get a reality, confronted with a reality, and then you kind of rationally navigate then, right? Because I don't think that was always how it came into being, their, let's say, navigation, that it was not always a steering, and it was very interrupted, and it was more chaotic and spontaneous in that way. And it was more, different things at the same time. So I think that even though Erika van der Sipt definitely, she's searching as well, when she's developing this reproductive navigation, she's also searching for what I am searching for, a concept that grapples with constraints and the complex in reproductive navigation. But I think that her analyses are more concerned with, again, the choices then, right? Okay, then I'm navigating after something, and then I choose something to do. A reproductive choice, right? Like getting abortion or whatever, right? Whereas I think mine did not go on the choice of abortion so much as it was all of these terms, like negotiation of their citizenship or renegotiation of their citizenship, all of those concepts. And that's what I wanted to, I want to get that together. Yeah, sorry.
Right, thank you. And as you mentioned that manoeuvring is management, kind of situational management, as opposed to maybe navigation geared and achieving some specific outcome. It brings to mind Goffman's stigma management, right, as well, right? So would you say that, for example, do I get it right, that stigma management is part of reproductive manoeuvring, but just part of it because there's so much more to it, such as citizenship, belonging? Is that right?
Yeah, I would not that I've engaged with the Goffman that much in my thesis, at least, or at all. But yes, it's also stigma management, right? So it's, but without reducing it to stigma management only, because there is also a growing literature on abortion stigma, which is very much needed. But again, I think that it's reducing what's else at stake as well, right? So it's, or not, I'm not saying that is reducing it, but here I think again that I didn't want to reduce it to make it only concerned with abortion stigma? Yes, but yes, I think that abortion or stigma management is a part of manoeuvring, right? Because that's what also is at stake. So it's all of those things that are at stake, and stigma is at stake, right? So.
Right. Yeah, and you also said that manoeuvring includes some kind of management of belonging and citizenship, as well as it applies to reproductive ambivalence in the unique context of the Nordic welfare state. That the concept of manoeuvring is particularly rooted in your ethnographic work in this context of the Nordic welfare state. So could you just say a little bit more about that? What are the specific relationships between manoeuvring and the Nordic welfare state?
Yeah, I would love to, because I think that there's a great difference between abortion literature or reproductive literature. Let's just call it abortion literature right now. From different countries than like Western societies, let's say. So I think that there is a great difference between these societies and the research that then comes out of it. So I think that there was a lot of mismatch, I would say, in the literature that I was reading about the Nordic countries, or not Nordic countries at all specifically, but like these Western societies, and how we then deal with also stigma management and choices and so forth. It was always like with this, at least to my sense, a much more, things are available. The agent is free, and you can then come to this how like a rational choice of managing stigma, and it's very rational, and it's very planned and navigated and stuff like that. And then you turn to these other research from other societies that I think, at least to what I feel, that these different kinds of literature allow for something totally different to come forth, which I think isn't allowed to come forth in these societies, the research in these societies. So I think that there was so much that resonated with the research from other countries that weren't, I'm saying it a bit simplistic, Western societies. And then I think that why not use those questions and those analyses and those grappling with Nordic countries? Like, why not? Because my empirical material, I think that illustrates so well that there's a mismatch in what you would expect from a study in the Nordic welfare society. So there was this whole surprise in how they did, and so I'm like thinking. I was touching a bit upon this in the thesis. Like, why not turn towards those analyses and contributions in a Nordic welfare society? So I'm sorry, I don't know if I'm answering your question even. I kind of I've winded myself up to not remember your question right now.
No. That's absolutely fine. So because of this mismatch of the expectation that in the Nordic welfare society some services, such as abortion services, would be provided, there is this need for manoeuvring, right? That emerges. So yes, this is absolutely clear. And one last question regarding the concept of manoeuvring, but from the viewpoint of methodology. I was wondering, was reproductive manoeuvring also present in your research methodology? In other words, were there any specific relationships between your research methods and your experience as a researcher and the central concept of manoeuvring? Because you do mention briefly in your discussion of methodology that and discussion of your approach to researching the vulnerable, how you needed a certain kind of sensitivity and an approach. And now if you took it further to the concept of manoeuvring, did you have to maneuver, and in what ways? And how did it impact on your developing of this concept of reproductive maneuvering as a researcher?
Yeah, I think that that goes very much into, and I'm really happy that you mentioned the whole vulnerable discussion that I open up, but only just open up in the thesis. And I hope that this is something that I can further write about and discuss, because I think that there was this whole I love the challenge in the discussions about when you're researching vulnerable participants or groups in society, right? And how these are like perceived differently when you're, or they can be perceived differently when you're a part of that society, or that it could be a group, or it could be an institution as well, or something else, right? So I think that manoeuvring is very much a part of the methodology of the way that I was in the field, and the way that the field was taking me in, right? So I think that I think that things were continuously tested on me as well, that I didn't notice until later, or it hasn't. And I think I noticed it, but I don't think that I've. It's been so clear to me as it is now, after I've I guess separated myself a bit from it. And then I was like, okay, actually, things have been very much tested on me as well. So I also had to maneuver, yes, in this landscape and in this. And I think my opening vignette in the thesis also touches or exemplifies this a bit, like how I was also maneuvering this landscape and trying to figure out like what is possible, without it being a rational thing, and without me being aware of that what I was doing. Yes, so I definitely think it is a part of a methodology, and that is very much in line with this way of doing, being inspired by critical ethnography, right? That it's much more of an engaged, like that you're a part of it all the time, that you're not separated from it, right?
Right, yeah, thank you. And you do write about many instances about where you had to manage those situations, interview situations, or situations in the close-knit society that you are part of. So that is clear. And well, let's move on from maneuvering to one thing that I've been thinking about while reading, that is the concept of coming out. You are not using this word, but to me, reading your work, also coming from queer studies, your work is a lot about coming out, about abortion, and you do quote Sarah Ahmed for that reason, and you write about the feeling of out of placeness and the need to manage it, and that's of course the meeting point between those different traditions. So I will call it coming out about abortion. And my question, I guess, is about this coming out about abortion. that is not keeping or not keeping the silence, right? And its relationships to social change. And I realize that that might not be the exact research question that you are actually asking, because you are asking about the management of silence and its relationship to subjectivity and its relationship to the feeling of belonging and citizenship. But you do hint in the last analysis chapter that that might herald social change, and that those women that you interviewed, if their subjectivities undergo some kind of change, they are also citizens that are agentic in some ways, and so that there is social change ongoing. And you also do mention some kind of public instances of social change, such as the discussion that has unfolded over the last years and the organization that has stepped forward, bringing this discussion to the public. So my question, to reiterate it, would be does imagination herald social change already? Or is this change ongoing only within subjectivity? And is it this process that you described in detail about performed belonging and feelings, right? That the women have. My reading is that it is both, because you also you write both about their performed belonging and their feelings, and at the same time you write about the turbulent social landscape and social change. But I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about it, because really, when reading your work, I was thinking, for example, about instances of coming out or not coming out in LGBTQ families, for example, in the so-called non-Western contexts. For instance, Joanna Miżelińska's research from Poland, Central and Eastern Europe, where people do not come out in some contexts because they do this kind of management of belonging that you also write about, and it's a very delicate process, right? But of course, then there's the question, what about social change, right? If people do not come out. So, and you have touched upon those questions a lot. So I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more. Is it both performed belonging and social change, or is it, just feelings?
Yeah, and I love that complexity as well, and thank you for bringing it up. And it's that's the thing, like how I think I have many thoughts about it. So I think these, yes, they're happening at the same time. You're a person and you're a citizen, and the citizen is or citizens are the society, right? So it's like it's happening at the same time, right? And you're testing within yourself, and you're like relating, right? So yes, definitely things are happening at the same time. And the other thing is that, well, I was calling it turbulence, this turbulent reproductive landscape, of course, and not a changing reproductive landscape, right? Because it was in the moment, like we were, like the field work was happening while everything was just erupting, right? And just like, shooken kind of thing. And so we didn't know if there was a change. We didn't know if there was, or we don't know if there's a social change in a sense of a structural change. So abortion practice, abortion legislation, or whatnot. And we don't know if there's a change, like culturally, morally, you could say. Because that would happen over a long time as well. And sometimes, legislations and structures can change before, the moral can can follow up. And then there is this, but what I could get access to was exactly these subjective, what was happening within these women. And I think that so that was the subjective, that was like the feeling of belonging or disbelonging, and what was like imaginatively happening and unfolding in those and tested and stuff. But then I think that we come into this, when talking about how when I'm raising this, like, well, could imaginations also herald social change? Then I think we're ethnographically, or it's very much tied up to the small-scale island society. So this to think about social change differently, or possibly differently, in different contexts, like what is possible, at least, because there's so much. I keep using the word at stake, but it's a really good way of describing things. But there's this, you could, because I think you would expect that things would happen differently in such a country, a modern society, right? You could go onto the streets and you could do and so. So the change, but it isn't, because of these close-knit relations and, and as Erica Hayfield, talks about this actions and identities that are, or individuals that are, tied to each other, and bound up to each other. And then I think that, okay, but then we must experience, because islands also go through social change, right? They're not static and just like the same always. They're also going through change, but then perhaps this could be different. It could be different than in a larger society. But also, this also takes part in a larger society. Maybe social change takes shape in different layers, right? And some of these social changes are also being in a larger society on an imaginative level, right? So I think that was what got me to approach that aspect or thought.
Right, thank you very much. And I think what I also found very interesting about your work was that you were showing simultaneously the women's intimate experiences, reproductive experiences, and through that you are talking about the social change, whether in subjectivity or in the turbulent reproductive landscape that you are delineating. And it brought to my mind what Marcia Inhorn and Sarah Franklin call the repro lens, right? Reproductive lens. That is, as you also say, abortion is a lens on norms and notions such as motherhood and gender, and on relationships between state, citizen state and society, as you wrote. So abortion as a lens on broader social processes, which was particularly maybe the subject of the analysis chapter 3 on the turbulent landscape. And yes, it is definitely a very, I think, interesting and unique and also careful take on it, to look at it from the specific society, the unique, close-knit island perspective. So thank you for that. And one, I guess, last thing, probably as I'm nearing the time, is a question that is not specifically on your argument in the dissertation, but I guess it's a question about the next steps in a way, maybe beyond the immediate questions of the dissertation, but something that you do mention. You do mention some conversations to be built with the perspectives of reproductive justice and reproductive injustice, And I was wondering, so do you think that silence is reproductive injustice in this case, or it is not? And from your knowledge of the field, how can the community work? What can the community work towards reproductive justice in the Faroe Islands look like? Because in my reading, you did mention reproductive justice and injustice, and you did mention that it's not the main focus. So it's totally fine, you know, from the viewpoint of the dissertation. But some examples that you gave, some vignettes and some stories were not only about reproductive injustice, but also about obstetric violence. Mm-hmm. You know, the example, for instance, of, I can't remember the name of the interviewee right now. It was one of the final cases in the thesis, who actually experienced what, you know, Dana and Davies and you know, other scholars would for sure, I think, define as obstetric violence. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on the possible conversations between your work and perspectives such as reproductive justice, community work, and, you know, next steps.
Yeah.
In that respect.
Yeah, I think.
I mean, they don't have to be necessarily the next steps, because there are many possible next steps. Mm-hmm. But, you know.
Yeah. But yes, and I'm really, thank you for that. It was very much so. One thing that I was, of course, formally talking to women about, like the formal interviews that I had, were very much engaged with these abortion experiences. But then, as I say, there are the 6 other reproductive narratives, right? And it's Alda that you're thinking of, I think, in the last discussion there, which is, and she kind of exemplifies the countless of stories that women came to me, informal conversations that I had with women, coming to me and telling me all of these quite often horrendous experiences in the reproductive healthcare system. And that's not to say that anyone is doing anything on purpose or anything like that, and that's not how social injustice or reproductive injustice happens, as you know. But how women were talking about, you know, pain, experiences of pain and not being taken seriously, and you know, almost being at a critical life situation, and some definitely were, and it's in these situations it has been luck that that we didn't go beyond that critical situation. So I definitely think that these stories are very much connected to social or reproductive injustice, and what can happen when the reproductive landscape is so restricted. Like, we know from other countries that isn't the same situation here, but that would be interesting to look more at. But we know from other, you know, that's one of the first things that, you know, came forth in abortion literature, as you know, also that, you know, also in Poland and all the disorders, Sylvia disorders and colleagues' research on, you know, how when it's a very restricted reproductive landscape, women will turn to more dangerous care routes and stuff, right, and so forth, and that's how the injustice is also. And I think that even though we don't see incidences of homemade or those dangerous abortion procedures in the Faroes, because that would be detected in the emergency room, of course, and we don't. It doesn't look as if that happens, but that's only. I guess that would only be because it's a society that is quite privileged. So women will turn to other routes that are less dangerous because they can, right? So that's a very well-known issue within abortion research. So I'm sorry. I think I've turned on a different route. So was I answering? So your question was again, just to repeat.
Yeah. You have answered that perfectly, and you also do write about it a little bit about, how can we take this work to conversations about reproductive justice, injustice, even community work, right?
Exactly.
So of course that's about not the argument of the dissertation, but kind of the next steps question, right? In this respect. Yeah.
And I think there's a lot to do there still, because even if we don't have those incidences that are, life-threatening or whatever, we still have a huge issue when there is this injustice, right? When there is, because these women talk about. I mean, the situation that Alda is in is a great example of how things can go wrong because of both a restricted reproductive or restricted abortion legislation, but also a structural silence. And because these, that was the example of the doctors not wanting to talk about it. It was kind of like she was saying the word abortion and everything just became kind of like silent and stuff like, and this curtain comes up and stuff. So it was kind of absurd in that way, but also that things can be, decisions can be made in the reproductive healthcare system that are unjust, right? In those terms, because of all of these. Yeah. So definitely, I think
and of course, what you have been doing, that is speaking to the women and gathering their experiences, and now making them heard is the way to go. Because of course, as you said, you can't just take the concept of reproductive justice from the United States or elsewhere and apply it here. No, you just need to speak to the women first and see what they think and feel and have experienced. So this is exactly what you have been doing. So thank you very much for that. I think my time is up. So I would just say that I'm really looking forward to reading and quoting your dissertation as a book in the future, or as further articles, as you wish. And I will hand over to the next speaker now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcin. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcin, for that. So we come to our third and final opponent, and that is Nana Schneiderman, who is Associate Professor at Aarhus University.
Hello.
Am I on? Now I am. Hi, Tui. I'm so excited to be here today with you. Thank you so much for taking us on this journey into the lived realities of abortion in the Faroe Islands. And thank you for taking me on this journey of doing research, because I think we met the first time when you were pregnant, and we're thinking about how to get into this field work. So I'm so excited to be here together with you today. I'm also so excited to get to talk to you about belonging. And in the next few minutes, I'll invite you to consider how belonging has come up in your research, both in terms of methodology, but also in terms of your analysis. And this comes from a very personal place for me, as someone who is in the Faroe Islands for the first time, not just as my mother's daughter, but also as a professional. So this is a quest which is very personal and indeed embodied for me, and I'm excited to share this with you. So thank you for allowing this. So we start with this question about being a native anthropologist, for whatever that is. You have a section in the thesis that's called Bodies Doing Research. And you write about how if you had been an outsider, and I quote, "I probably would not have been aware of the abortion landscape, but neither would I have had anything at stake. At the same time, very central to your thesis is the question about belonging. And to sort of boil it down, belonging, as you write it, is about being and becoming, but also longing. So it's a longing in motion. So when you write, neither would I have had anything at stake, what was at stake for you in doing this research? How was belonging set in motion or put at stake in new ways by your research? And what was the motion and the longing here?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. So I think that when I wrote exactly that thing, that I think what I was thinking about in those terms, because I say it, I wouldn't have anything at stake because, you know, I'm an inside or I'm a native or, you know, and that, you know, that is also a discussion in itself, what that is. So that was my thoughts on if you come without, I love how the way Tina Gammeltoft talks about belonging, because she's talking about, you know, a codependency, something that, you know, I don't only, you know, belonging is not just, you know, great and, you know, a good thing. It's also, you know, you are of something and you are, someone is kind of owning you. That's very, you know, harshly set up, but she's saying that, you know, it's not just something that, yay, I belong, and then it's just like, I can do whatever because I'm in. It's not like being in a box and then out of a box, right? It's much more constrained in that way. So I think that how it came into what was concerned right there was that if I did not belong, and that is very much, that can be discussed as well, I could ask kind of whatever, because nothing, I didn't own it in some way, and I wasn't attached. So I could have just went in and just asked whatever without having to relate to what was at stake for them. And in that way, by doing that, if I have to think of what is at stake for them, then I have something at stake. Because that's what, you know, then I have to you know, as we were talking also about earlier, kind of, or we touched upon earlier with Stina, I think these things were. I was these things like the abortion landscape and what was at stake politically and morally were always tested on me as well. And so, you know, it was not only abortion that was the issue, but also my belonging as a Faroese woman, but also my motherhood being or was also at stake. You know, just the fact that going into the field and interviewing while pregnant, what did that mean? Or while I was nursing my child, what did that mean? And so like things were always like tested on me, this whole thing of what was kind of as an example almost of what was at stake for the women. So in that way, I think those things were at stake of my belonging, like how did I belong to the Faroe Islands and how did I position myself, but how did I also embody motherhood or the Faroese woman in the Faroes, or the other, or a different abortion narrative in the Faroes.
All right. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
That was a really good answer. And it kind of brings me to the next part that I wanted to ask about in terms of belonging to Faroese society and doing fieldwork here as well. And you've now described the sort of ambivalence that is inherent in belonging. So I want to talk a little bit about that ambivalence as it is phrased by Ginsberg and Rapp as entangled fieldwork, and how that surfaces or is used actively in your analysis. And specifically, I want to talk to you about that, about doing fieldwork in everyday life and being a daughter and a granddaughter, as we hear about, and being also a mother and a partner and an activist. So focus in the thesis is absolutely understandably on the narratives of the women that you interviewed. But can you say more about how living in the Faroe Islands during the time of the research and doing participant observation and other sources of data was part of your fieldwork, and how they contributed to your analysis and the choices you've made? Yeah.
Definitely. So I think that there's this whole development, there's this whole thing in anthropology, of course, of autoethnography, right? And I definitely think that that would be a great thing to do, to explore more in a whole analysis, for itself, which I definitely see more differently than I did while I was in it. So while time has passed and stuff, because I think my position also affected, or completely affected, and that's also the whole thing about being, doing or following those. If we take for granted Donna Haraway's situated knowledges, and also entanglement, or being entangled in the research field by Ginsberg and Rapp, that things can take place because of one's self, right? And the interplay between these two. So I think that what allowed to take place in these formal interviews was a difference in because of my position and my body and my attachment and so forth, allowed for something different than an explanation. Sometimes things, they could go into different kinds of conversations than explaining the cultural landscape or the legislations or the words, for that matter, or something like that, right? And so I think that was one thing that gave me an empirical knowledge, but also that you're asking into how in my participant observations in my everyday life, motherhood and abortion and reproduction was continuously an issue, an aspect, a theme in my life here. So it wasn't as if I went from home, did whatever out, and then I researched into this theme. But rather it was like at the supermarket, but how can you, I was confronted with my way of being a mother as well, going to work early on, letting a total stranger take care of my baby, which is her father. So not so much of a stranger. So these things. So and that's where abortion also is more than abortion, right? We need to, when we talk about abortion, we will talk about motherhood, we will talk about other reproductive, and we will talk about sexuality, and we will talk about all these things. So it was getting knowledge of something more than just my preconceived knowledge of being a Faroese, but it was like it was here and now, getting knowledge, cultural knowledge, or whatever it is, while being in the field. If I was, I think again here, if I was not Faroese, I don't think I would have been asked that question, right? I don't think people would expect of me to be a different kind of mom, or what they imagined me being. If I would get other questions, totally. It's not that an outsider would not get questions, but they would be different, right? So in that way, it was my being in the field was completely giving empirical knowledge all the time, which also makes it difficult to separate.
Yeah, so that sort of total immersion makes it difficult maybe to separate what was the field work and what was my life. Mm-hmm. And there I think, I don't know, I'm just gonna go off script for a minute here, because I arrived 2 days ago for the first time as not my mother's daughter or granddaughter to my grandparents, but as an anthropologist coming here to do work. And I took a walk in the Plantagenet. And I found myself there at the big monument and remembering myself being a small child with my mother. And suddenly I just stood there weeping for the child, but also for this grown woman who is now a professional. So I want to also turn this question on its head, because I'm really puzzled by this and excited in a sense of saying, what did doing research in the Faroe Islands do to your belonging as a Faroese person? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Often we ask the other way around, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it definitely, it is turning it around in a really great way, actually, because that also comes into what's at stake. Because it's easy to say that you belong, but I also did not belong to, I was also coming from 11 years abroad, which isn't weird in the Faroe Islands. Many people, travel and live abroad for a very long time, so that's not special in that sense. But I was also confronted with this, kind of a feeling like just being like placed. Now I'm here. Okay, now let's talk. Kind of like, which made me my self-doubt of my belonging. Like, now, do you belong that much as you say? Like, you weren't here when this and that happened, or whatever, right? And in that way, I think throughout the whole, those 2 years, I more so doubted my belonging than feeling a belonging. Not that anyone else said so to me, but I think different experiences will make you like, oh, but maybe I'm not doing it exactly how it should be, perhaps, or I just came here and. What can I allow myself to say and stuff like that. So I think that I was, throughout being here, I was doubting my belonging. And then I think today, I think that it has strengthened some, it has definitely, it has constructed a new kind of belonging, not strengthen, that's a wrong word, but it has constructed a new kind of being here, because that was the first time I came here on my own, without living at my parents' house, and without, being a part of it in that way, just born a part of it. Now you're just a part of it because you just are, you're born here. And now I was like kind of like placed here, and then I had to kind of like make it, make a belonging, like, and like show it, kind of thing. So I think that it has tested my belonging, and then I don't know if I'm taking it too far, but saying a new belonging is kind of emerging.
I like the term of reconstruction,
Yeah.
or rebuilding, or remaking, and I think it also, interesting ways speaks back to this concept of entangled fieldwork, which we often think about from sort of one perspective, not so much the other, though that also is part of what makes our knowledge and our analysis when we work anthropologically. Right, so I want to kind of round off that part, but still stick with the belonging and being an insider and an outsider, and the work of analysis as kind of moving from within the material and becoming a stranger to it by using concepts and theories and sort of coming back into it and kind of doing this little weave where you have an advantage doing field work in the Faroe Islands that not everyone has, in that you know the language. Now you know where I'm going. We're going to talk a little bit about ethnographic concepts, because your thesis is full of all these exciting words, all these narratives, these stories about experiences. Some of them are yours, some of them are from the women that you've talked to. And then there are all these really great concepts: belonging, reproductive manoeuvring, turbulent landscapes, and the concepts that kind of prop them up. But what kind of stands there is how the ways that some of these phenomena are conceptualized in the field, or maybe by the women themselves, how that might enlighten our understandings of these theoretical concepts. So I want to just play a little game with you and speak Faroese. Are you ready? Okay, so for instance, silence is a central concept here. What would be the words that women would use, or you would use in a conversation, for silence?
Usually used was tøgn, but often it was, which now that you make me answer this makes me reflect a lot about it. But what came up, and I don't remember where this came from. I don't remember if it was something that I've talked about or if it's something that is talked about, but there was this concept of larmande tøgn. So like a noisy silence, because it was so silent. So it was filling the room, right? And now I really can't remember where that comes from, but I don't think it, right now I don't think it comes from only myself, but that was something that I was quite interested in when I was working with this silence article, right? And which I was working for a long time. So this noisy silence that was just kind of taking over the whole room, right? Yeah. So I think that was a word, tøgn or larmande tøgn.
And if we were to go into this word tøgn, what kind of word is that in the Faroese language? What are synonyms? What are antonyms? You know, what are other words for silence, for instance?
I think more than words, it was a way of, saying things that. So sentences, rather.
What kinds of sentences would that be?
So that would be kind of at ikke tosa,
Yeah.
at ikke,
Yeah.
stuff like that. But again, it's not that it's so. I'm not sure if you were asking me into the interview situations, if these women were saying like, oh, her en tøgn, eller, ungen tosar det, eller, jeg kan ikke si det. Stuff like that. So sometimes, yes, things were like explicitly said in that way, that her, jeg kan ikke fortelle om henne, eller ungen skal si det, eller ungen må vite det. Stuff like that. No one has to know. I can't say it, or, things aren't said, and stuff like that. Sometimes these were said, but often it was the lack of those words that expressed the silence to me.
I think in somewhere in the thesis, you have this little, it's about your being an insider, but I think it said a lot about the concept of silence that you're really writing about, in the way that some of the stories and some of the women would speak to you and say,
Yeah.
du weißt.
Yeah.
Og så siger man det ikke. And I just think, for instance, that all those little snippets here, all of those, I think they give us a very delicate understanding of what silence is in Faroese, but also the different kinds of silences that Faroese people might be in. I mean, we all are also known to sometimes just like sit around quietly, which is different, right? And sometimes also larmande. And I think also relates to questions about belonging. So anyway, so there's lots of these different concepts that I can't wait for you to also unfold in the book. And I'm excited about that. Yeah?
It's going to be a great book.
Okay, good. Right. So this now brings me to sort of a fourth question about belonging and ambivalence that relates a little bit to your analysis of citizenship, but also to imagination. But also I think to these local concepts of what can be said and not said. So there's two questions here, and I'll start with the first. And it goes back also to Martin's questions about social change a little bit. So the reproductive landscape is in turmoil. And you use the concept of turmoil to sort of say there's an upheaval, but it does not necessarily have a direction as such. Yet, within this turmoil, can you say something about how the meaning of some of these local concepts around reproductive health are changing? So for instance, the uses of the words abortion, but also maybe other words around how you make choices or maneuver your reproductive path.
Yeah, so in the field, like how it's used in the field or contested in the field. Yeah. So definitely, because you can use, probably most for the online followers, you can use the word fostertöka, and then you can use the word abortion as well, aborst. And I think that this one was unfolded in the locally quite a lot, especially in 2017, 18, 19, where this was very much debated, right? Like to use the concept, do you use the concept or the word fostertöka, or do you use the word aborst, right? So these were taking up locally very much, and they displayed what was happening as well, right? So they displayed, for one thing, they displayed I think the choice of words has different things at stake. So it's not only taking the fetus, it can also be a part of what is your political, standpoint, or in relation of the Denmark-Faroe Island relationship. And so if you use fostertørka, you can still be pro-abortion in legal terms, but be very pro-Faroese language, as a language of a bit more static understanding of a language. At least that's my suggestion of it. And so it can mean different things, right? But this was very much debated in the first few years of when everything was like the tables were turning, right? And then I think that now it's less and less debated, these uses of either fostertørka or abort. I think that now it's like different kind of local debates going on about that. Yeah.
Okay, so a follow-up on that, and this is it's a curiosity that I've had since I saw this Instagram campaign around the Women's Day this year. I think so, yeah. Where a number of women came out in little videos on Instagram saying, "Jeg har taget en abort." And that is, that made me think about how we as anthropologists have to think about local concepts, not just as the concepts themselves, but also the context in which they're used. So in Danish, when you say, "Jeg har fået en abort," abortion is something that you get. I had an abortion. You probably also say that in English. But in Faroese, at least how it was used in this campaign, abortion was something that you took. So what does that difference tell you about what kind of phenomenon this is?
Now, I'm not a linguistic, of course, and I have huge respect for that, of course, because that's a whole, study in itself. And I think my best, I would say, guess here is that, if you say, you would say, "You have a teacher fostertørka," because that's fostertørka, to take the fetus. So I've taken the fetus. So that's a given, like you would say, "I've taken it," right? And so perhaps there's a simple answer to this, and then I'll come to the more complicated answer. And so the simple answer can also be like, rather than saying fostertørka, I've taken abort, not taking fostertørka. Yeah. But the more different, now that you're asking me, and I'm reflecting upon it, then I'm thinking that it can also hint towards the non-right, right? So, you've taken it, you haven't gotten it because you were never allowed to get it. So maybe it's a brilliant question. And it's something that, we can find out after a couple of years when probably the abortion legislation, or if the abortion legislation will change at some point to more liberal, we can see if people will start saying getting, having, as a, now that we're talking about, the Nordic welfare subjects, they get stuff because they're entitled to stuff, and they don't sneak towards stuff or take it or, fight for it, right? So yeah, it's a great question. It's a really good question.
Thank you so much. And thank you for thinking with me about these things. This is stuff that makes me very excited. So that kind of the changing meaning of concepts and also the changing meaning of abortion kind of brings me to sort of the last bit about, second to last bit about belonging here. And that is how the last part of your analysis on imagination kind of binds together questions about temporality and belonging or citizenship. And that is, how women negotiate and construct belonging to a Faroese society through imagining or thinking about what would I have done differently if things were different. What kinds of action might I have taken? When would I have spoken up had I felt more secure, or so on and so forth. And I'm thinking about Barbara's story, and her thinking about, she's longing for a future that would have happened, right? The future that would have happened if things had been different. And at the same time, you're writing about belonging, as you say, as something that it's not just about being this great thing. I belong, I'm feeling good, I'm seen, it's something that's always ambivalent. It's something that's always somehow a little disjointed from reality, and it's also maybe confining at times. And so I want to relate this longing for a future that would have happened, because in those futures, it seems that these women are able to construct a perfect belonging. In that future that would have happened, is it a future conditional tense, or is it almost kind of a subjunctive mode of like the as if things had been different, then I would have been able to have that perfect belonging. But as you write, such a seamless belonging does not really exist, and neither does citizenship, and those things are related here. So help me to think about how you understand belonging here as something slightly displaced into a future that would maybe have happened, or something that is imagined more than embodied.
So I think that what comes to my mind right now, just to get it started, I'm thinking about these other studies in the Faroes, especially by Hayfield, where they're, where women are, and it comes into this constrained belonging, because they're like, because it's a privileged society, right, in that way. And many of the women also have tried living in other and have the possibility to choose different, now we'll talk very, rational, like choosing different lives.
Yeah, sure.
Always be aware of those rational notions. And then they're like, yes, I had many more opportunities for my rights. I had more rights as a female citizen in another Nordic country. I had, career opportunities that I won't have here, but still they choose to return here because there's something else that's. So it's like a choice of, either you can get this, or you can get that here that you will never get there. And in their study is very much reflected upon their choice of rather belonging here is very much reflected on their, again, motherhood and like their children, because their children will have a better life here. And it's more, my family is here, and that will, so I will let go of the other possible possibilities I would have had. So I think that it's also their imaginations are also, I say that they're propelled by an othering, but they're also similarly propelled by a knowledge to something else that they know, because they know of other possible lives, right? So it's constrained in that way, this belonging, and they, and they rather want to, it's not everyone who some will leave, right? As you know, in your own family, and right. But that also reflects on this. I'm not sure if I'm getting at what you were fishing at here.
Yeah, I think you kind of are. I think you kind of are, and then I think you're also opening something new that's super cool and exciting, and that is when we're doing our maneuvering, our little tiny movements, that might not be strategic, but rather more tactical, sort of figuring our way out. There's also the longing for family. There's the longing for having children, for rearing children, for seeing them grow. That seems to be a global phenomenon. When you say these things, I do feel work in Uganda sometimes, and I see these women who stay in terrible relationships, but my children will have a better future here. They will have a home, they will have a life, and that's also a happiness. And so I think that kind of constrained belonging, or just belonging that is by itself constraining as such, I think is such a nice way of thinking about it. Which brings me to the very last question about belonging. Because now we've talked about those families and those belonging as this, you call it intersubjective and contingent. Towards the end of your thesis, you reflect upon the stuff that's not in the thesis. And I'll just bring up this one little thing so that we can talk about it in relation to belonging. And you ask on page 184, well, you say, I've done this study now of this narrative of women who had an abortion or have reproductive dilemmas. And there are a lot about what the women did or thought or experienced. But they also take action with reference to other people. So where are all these other people in the analysis? And specifically, to become pregnant, you usually need to have some sort of dude material. You might not actually need a man, but there's particular kinds of reproductive substances that need to come into play. And where are they? And how does that sort of cut, as you say, does that reproduce abortion as an individual woman's choice? So based on your fieldwork and the broader thing that we're talking now about families and value, family and belonging, what do you think? Where are these other people?
It's a great question, and I think it's I kind of think of it in the same way as, like, perhaps we can think of the whole history of feminist studies within reproduction and gender studies, that you kind of, like, from the beginning you started out with the women, right? And that was like that's where we're at, and now it's just moved in so many great directions of including so much more than just like a women's issue, to show how it's not only a white woman's issue, right? And I think that's kind of also you could kind of like make that symbolic, like comparison to the historic development of these studies, and then to like mine, who like, again, I think nothing had been done on this before in the Faroes locally, and so like, where do you start, and what is enough? Like, what also, again, to be sensitive here, or not insensitive in that simplistic understanding of substance, but be caring, like to understand it, to do what is not just possible, but also what is ethically a good choice to make. So that's why I have focused on these women, but all the other people are there. They are there, and they're mentioning them. They're never mentioning all of this without both the partners or random men that they got pregnant with, which happens, of course, but also family members, like abortion, also because abortion is restricted in the Faroes. So you cannot make this choice on your own. You have to have often access to this knowledge of getting abortion, like which doctor to go to or whatnot, through family, friends, whatever. And also, if the males were, these were exclusively heterosexual couple or people that I was talking to, and not on purpose. But also if the male person in this example was absent, his absent is very much there, right? So that's also a presence, right? So I think that definitely that if I could, or when I will go further into this, it must not only include women, because not only abortion is not only for women or not only concerning women, but reproduction is not only concerning women, and motherhood is not only concerning women. It's happening interrelationally and through the society and so forth. So definitely something that is. But I think again, it was at that moment ethically also both more possible and in a way, right thing to do.
All right. Thank you for that really good answer and that opening into sort of that broader landscape and also the next studies that might be warranted after this groundbreaking first step. So Turið, I here want to thank you so much for indeed groundbreaking research and also for having this conversation with me. And then I will give the word back to, I think, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you to our three excellent opponents and to Turid's excellent responses. This has been a thoroughly interesting 3 sessions. Now, I did start off by saying that if anybody has questions, please let me know in the break. I didn't get anybody who sort of pointed out that they wanted to ask any questions, but I'm going to give you the opportunity, in case you didn't catch me in the break. Is there anybody who would like to ask Turið any questions or question? Well, it looks like you've been very thorough, Turið. Now, what's going to happen now is that before the assessment committee goes out to vote, Nicole is going to just wrap up this session before we leave for voting.
Thank you. So, Turið, I have this tremendous honor to wrap up this great session. And I've been writing, you could say, main arguments or main perspectives from the last hours down, and I think I'll try to wrap them up. I think we have some great perspectives that we can take with us home. And I also have one last question, if you permit. So, we've listened to a dialogue containing rich exchanges concerning the origins of the research question, the interconnection between the research questions through the concept of reproductive manoeuvring, but also reflections on why we need women's voices and how these voices have informed the final analysis of the thesis. You also had a very interesting discussion about embodiment and how you can work differently with embodiment, but also perhaps on the difficulty of working embodiment when you have, like you said, a lack of bodily narratives. Just posing down this. We have witnessed an important exchange with Marcin on the key concept of reproductive manoeuvring and its conceptual contribution to other anthropological concepts such as the reproductive or social navigation. We have listened to a dialogue on the methodology of the thesis, the perspective and ambivalence of belonging, and the different insights the ethnography has contributed with regards to the question of abortion. And finally, we have heard Turið, or your reflections, on the future of a continuing anthropology of Faroe Island, or perhaps what you started out by saying, the need for a mapping of abortion in the Faroe Island. So this would be my suggestion for wrapping up, which is quite impressive, I think, for a session of approximately 3 hours. I think we have a huge material to go home with and work on further on. So I have one last question, and I wanted to pose this question, although I think it's a bit delicate question to pose, because it involves the past between the two countries of Denmark and the Faroe Islands. But recently, a Danish rapporteur for gender equality from a Danish political party, Enhedslisten, made the proposition of making abortion easier for women from the Faroe Islands, giving the women to come to Denmark for abortion without charging the medical intervention. That was a proposition made on the 29th of May, just some days ago. And that started me thinking about your thesis. Because as you write in your thesis, it's only women with some kind of relation to Denmark who can actually have an abortion in the country. And I would think that the political proposal illustrates perhaps quite well the ambivalent relationship between the two countries. And I could imagine that some politicians in this country would find it perhaps provocative to hear that Denmark suggests a way to counteract on the abortion law in this country. So my question would be, how is the question of reproductive politics also a question representing the ambivalent relationship between the two countries? I know it's a huge and large question to pose at the end of the day, but I would like to hear some of your preliminary thoughts. I know we have had these discussions before, you and I know you have taken an active choice of not integrating some of these thoughts in a thesis, but somehow we always keep on surfing on the surface of this discussion. So I think it would be nice to just hear some thoughts on this.
Thank you. Yes. And that's true. It's difficult to get around it without or past it, right? That discussion. And I think so. If I were to reflect a bit, what I hear you ask me is to reflect a bit on this. For instance, let's take that proposal from Enhedslisten, or a representative from Enhedslisten. I think I have two thoughts about it in the way that, like you reflected upon, it can be provoking to pose that question, because of course, as we know, not only the relationship between Denmark and Greenland is precarious, it's also precarious between the Faroe Islands and Denmark, of course. And of course, I'm not an expert on this, but I think that knowing that relationship, and it can be, for one thing, is that yes, it can be like a political act in that way. So to get a reaction, right, and to force, or support a discussion that's already taken place in the Faroes internally. So that's something it can do. But then again, if you think about it, there are so many health services that Faroese citizens go to Denmark to get for free. So I mean, and in especially US abortion literature, you don't talk about abortion rights, you talk about abortion healthcare, right? So if we think in line with their research, it's healthcare as if like any other healthcare. So in some way, it can also be, you can understand this proposal from different aspects, and I think whatever it is, it does something, right? To say so, to propose this, right? Either it provokes politicians, and this kind of and things are happening on a larger scale between Denmark, Faroes, Denmark, Greenland, and the three countries them in between. So things are already happening there. Things are taking up, and with the whole discussion right now with in the foreign politics and stuff like that. So I think that that could be a part of that discussion, right? To say, but what is our connection here? What is can we situate? Can we put abortion healthcare services at the same level of other healthcare services that Faroese citizens do get access to for free in Denmark as Danish citizens?
Thank you, Turið. I think that was a really, really nice conclusion, and it wraps really nicely your reflections. You started out by talking or inviting us to think through the notion of care. So I think that's a really nice place to say thank you for your reflections on that as well. And it's now the time for the PhD assessment to withdraw. We'll be back with some words, some recommendations on your thesis. So thank you very much.
There we go. Right, so I was just saying that it was a fairly easy decision for us. Thank you, Turið. You have defended very well. We have written a statement, which is that the committee has found that the lecture and subsequent discussion of the thesis were conducted at the highest academic level. The responses were creative and innovative, and we see you, the candidate, as a promising young scholar. The thesis and defence pointed in directions of new avenues of research in the anthropology of reproductive health, citizenship and belonging. We have no hesitation in concluding that the requirements of Section 3 of the Danish Ph.D. order and Chapter 5 of the Executive Order regarding Ph.D. studies at the University of the Faroe Islands have been satisfied. Thus, in conclusion, the Assessment Committee recommends that a Ph.D. degree will be awarded. Thank you and congratulations, Turið, and I think we have some flowers here. Gjør så vel. Fantastic, and on behalf of the Assessment Committee, we would like to thank you for the opportunity to partake in the privilege of being part of your PhD process at the end here. And this concludes the formal part of the PhD defence. So we have a buffet here and hope that people have time to share with Turið her success and have a chat amongst yourselves and with Turið. So thank you very much for this afternoon.